Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Teachers Aligned podcast. I'm Todd Scholl, and this is episode number 31. And I got to admit, I'm a little bit of a geeked up today, more than normal, because I have a very, very special guest. And when this guest agreed to be on the podcast, I ran up. My wife was in the bedroom, and I ran up to the bedroom and I pulled out one of his books and I said, guess who's going to be on my podcast? And showed her the book, and she was very excited for me. But without further ado, my guest today is a psychologist, senior fellow of UC Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center, and New York Times best-selling author. His books have been published in 29 languages and include Resilient, Hardwiring Happiness, Buddha's Brain, Just One Thing, and Mother Nurture, with 900,000 copies in English alone. His newest book is called Neurodharma, Science, Wisdom, and Steps to the Highest Happiness. That's going to be released May 5th. So you can go out and celebrate May the 4th, all you Star Wars fans. And then the next day, you can head out to the bookstores. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you're going to need to order this online and get the new book, Neurodharma. He's the founder of the Wellspring Institute for Neuroscience and Contemplative Wisdom. He's lectured at NASA, Google, Oxford, and Harvard, taught meditation centers worldwide. His work has been featured on the BBC, CBS, and NPR, and 150,000 subscribers receive his free Just One Thing newsletter every week. He has a variety of popular online programs in positive neuroplasticity with scholarships available for those with financial need. He's been a trustee of Saybrook University, served on the board of Spirit Rock Meditation Center, and was president of the board of Family Works, a community agency. He began meditating in 1974, trained in several traditions, and leads a weekly meditation gathering. He and his wife live in Northern California and have 2 children. He enjoys being in the wilderness, taking breaks from emails, and occasionally being on podcasts. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Rick Hanson. Welcome, Dr. Hanson.
Well, thank you, Todd, and please call me Rick. And, I think there's a special place in heaven for teachers, for educators. I really do. And so I'm honored to be on your show.
Well, again, thanks so much. I know you must have a busy schedule, and this whole pandemic has really kind of upset everybody's schedules, and everybody's figuring out how to navigate through this and how to stay communicated and connected and continue doing the work, but maybe in virtual environments. Let me ask you, just human, how are you doing?
Thank you. Well, I'm basically doing fine. Our children are safe. They're adults. They're 32 and 29. That's kind of a check that box. Fairly early on, it became clear to my wife and me that it was just not wise to take the risk of getting infected, at least for a while. We're in our mid-60s, and our health is very good, but why take the chance? So I have a lot of background in rock climbing and in the wilderness in very hazardous situations where there's a crystal clear difference between have to and want to. Wow. And want to just gets pushed aside in favor of have to. And this is one of those have to situations. So as much as we can, we've kind of turned it into a weird game, just being very mindful of what our fingers are touching and mindful of the dates that something gets delivered to our house, so we leave it outside for a few days. And internally, I feel a lot of compassion for the people that are really being slammed. It's kind of like a storm. I mean, it's raining on everyone, but it's raining harder on many people than those like myself who are quite privileged and fortunate and blessed and able to kind of ride it out pretty easily. So fundamentally doing okay. I think people are dealing with a lot of loss these days, and it's in the air. And with that, it's helpfully a focus on gain, loss and gain, and also what is underneath it all that cannot be lost and nor gained. It can be found, but it can't be lost or gained. And it's enduring inside us. So the goodness inside you, the goodness inside me, the goodness inside people who work with children of all ages, educators in all roles. So I think that's good to stay in touch with, that underlying goodness, which will strengthen us to deal with the badness, in a general sense of what we're dealing with these days.
I think, specifically with teachers, they're dealing with a sudden loss of direct connection with their students,
Yeah.
and not knowing when that's going to be reestablished. Also worrying about, are they safe? Are they continuing to learn? What are the resources are at home? And how are they going to? It's everything's so up in the air for teachers that they're being told on one hand they have to now modify the curriculum and deliver it, and they're accountable for delivering it to all students who may have differing home situations, and trying to navigate their own lives and their own children and their own families and their own concerns. What would be some advice that you would give to, and this is probably relevant for folks that aren't teachers, but specifically for teachers, what would you recommend in terms of helping them maintain a sense of well-being and balance during a time that seems so unbalanced?
Yeah. Um, First, find your footing. In other words, be aware of how you feel about it all. It's a scramble. I mean, part of also what I'm experiencing, like so many others, amidst the loss, is like with a heavy heart, our son left our home yesterday where he'd been living, and he's leaving the bubble. So it's going to be a long time before I hug him again,
Yeah.
for example. Uh, and it's a frazzling time. It's an irksome time. There's a lot going on. Step one is to accept how you feel.
Mm.
Be mindfully aware of it. Try to hold it with a kind of spaciousness so it's not overwhelming, but just we have to tell the truth about what it's like, right? We start there, because if we don't start there in the saying, what you resist persists. So that's a very important place to start. And with that, a sense of compassion for oneself, the way this is landing, it's hard, and to just tell the truth about that to yourself with a strong feeling of support. I think that's step one. Step two, I call it calm and center. Just this is a time that's very disturbing. It's a textbook prescription for rattling people. It's a
Mm.
threat that's accelerating. It's invasive. It's coming from so many directions. There's a lot of confusion about it. There's not a lot of clarity in some places that leadership at the highest levels is really wrapping its arms around it. That's very disturbing for people. Where can they look for reliability and trustworthiness, right? So it's very rattling. Because it's rattling, because the wind is howling, because we're in the middle of a storm, we have to calm and center, calm and center. And there's simple keys to that. Exhalations naturally slow the heart rate and calm down the nervous system by engaging the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system. Pulling up the body memory of when you had been strong in the past, lifting that weight the last repetition, or running that last mile, or just standing by the bedside, as I can recall of your aging father, really tired, but you're just going to hang in there. You are going to endure. So getting in touch with that in whatever form, your own grit, your own strength inside, that's a real key to calm and center. And another that's really great neurologically as kind of a trick is to tune into the internal sensations of your body. That naturally quiets verbal chatter, brings you into the present. And another neurological trick is to have a sense of the things as a whole. Your body as a whole, the room you're in as a whole, the gestalt, the whole world, as a whole. That also naturally quiets rumination and negativity and obsessing about the future, brings you into the present. It's very integrative. So calm and center. And then last, tend and befriend. That's a term from Shelley Taylor at UCLA. Has to do with responding to stress by taking good care of others, remembering that they're scared too. Holding them in your heart, reaching out to others. I feel a sense of camaraderie with you, Todd, that we're in this together. We're scrambling. I'm scrambling from a home studio. You're probably scrambling too. I got on this call a little late because I was scrambling to hook up my gear properly. And we're in it together, and there's that sense of camaraderie. So those are the big three for me. Find your footing, including figuring out the actions you're going to take, calm and center, and tend to befriend.
This moment in time presents a really good opportunity, although it's not something we would choose, but it's a good opportunity for folks to really understand the concept of negativity bias that you've talked a lot about in your books, and is something that when I present information on mindfulness and stress reduction for teachers, I talk about how we all have that negativity bias. For those who may not understand that concept, can you explain what negativity bias is and how that may be playing a role in people generating their own suffering during a time like this?
It's one of the most powerful ideas from neuroscience. And it's the basic fact that we tend toward doing 5 things. I'll just quickly go through them, and you can watch yourself doing them. And I find, by the way, I've worked a lot with children. I did my dissertation on 15-month-olds. I've worked in a lot of schools. I've done a lot of child therapy. And I find with kids of all ages, when you explain this to them, it's really a relief. The short version is you've got a brain that's like Velcro for bad experiences, but Teflon for good ones. Kaboom. You can just kind of get that. So basically, for survival purposes, we evolved to 1, scan for bad news. 2, over-focus upon it, kind of ignoring the good news around it. 3, overreact to it. People react more to pain than to pleasure, more to loss than to gain. 4, fast-track the passage into memory. Once burned, twice shy. Never forget. For example, negative interactions in a relationship have more impact than positive ones do, which is why positive interactions need to outnumber negative interactions by a lot, right? Otherwise, there's a impact, particularly of those negative moments with other people. And then last, the brain gets sensitized, 5th, through cortisol to negative experiences, including mild ones of stress, frustration, getting irked, being pressured, being caught, let's say as an educator between administration, parents, you want to help the kids, what do you do? Just all that. Those kind of experiences release cortisol, stress hormone, which goes up into the brain and sensitizes the alarm bell of the brain, the amygdala, while weakening another part of the brain, the hippocampus, that calms and regulates the amygdala, and also in other ways regulates stress reactivity. Problem is then stress today, including feeling worried or blue or lonely, stress today makes us a little bit more vulnerable to stress tomorrow. So we experience a little more stress tomorrow, which makes us even more vulnerable to stress the day after that. So that's the negativity bias in the nutshell. And the takeaway for me about it is to really appreciate its functioning, its happening, value it when it's appropriate, like if you're dealing with really tough situations, you're doing a combat tour of duty or growing up in what feels like a war zone. But most of the time, the negativity bias creates unnecessary conflict and suffering. So be aware of the negative. I don't believe in positive thinking. I believe in realistic thinking. I want to see the whole world for what it really is. So deal with real issues, but disengage from them as fast as you can. Disengage from your negative reactions to them. In other words, we can cope while feeling at peace inside ourselves. We can deal with conflicts with others while still holding them in our heart, for example. But we don't have to add the ruminating or the resenting or the positionality, the drivenness, the intensity. We just don't need to add that if we can possibly not do that. And then last, as much as you can, take in the good. Not looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, recognizing the fact that, for example, right now, even though there's some hassles, it's amazing. I'm in a converted bedroom in my home with some cool microphones, and we're seeing each other across the internet with technology that was just didn't exist 10 years ago, definitely didn't exist when I was growing up as a kid. So, amidst the crud, we can recognize the good. And when we have a chance to have beneficial experiences, a moment of calming, a moment of easing, a sense of reassurance and relief, getting home at the end of the day and plopping, feeling connected with another person, getting something done, feeling the goodness inside your own heart, that you're a decent person, even if you do get cranked up sometime, as I do. These are all opportunities for us to take in the good and to stay with the experience for a breath or longer, helping the neurons to keep firing so that they will wire inside our brains and gradually hardwire the residues of our beneficial experiences into our own nervous system. So then we take them with us wherever we go.
Right. I've seen that I think some people are not conscious of this negativity bias and will consume a lot of news, which is essentially an illustration of human negativity bias, because they're
Yeah.
telling all the things that are wrong. And then also through scrolling through social media, I think we as we scroll through, what stands out are the things that make us upset or angry or scared. And those are the things that kind of stick with us, like you said, like Velcro. So I've been recommending that folks who are feeling these intense emotions kind of do a scan of what, like you said, what are they taking in? Is it all alarm bells and negativity? Are there other things that you could do to balance that out? Maybe you could talk a little bit about the role that news plays and the news and social media.
Well, I think that's a great example, Todd, of what we were talking about we can cope, including with really challenging situations, without allowing the excessive and unnecessary irritation, anxiety, helpless outrage, which I think a lot of people are feeling these days. We can cope with, and we can feel these natural feelings. I'm not talking about suppressing anything or pushing anything away. We can cope, we can feel these feelings, but we don't need to dwell in them. We don't need to feed them. We don't need to follow them. We don't need to become, as I have friends who are in this state, they're in a tizzy 24/7, and it's not adding any value. So question is exactly right? How do we keep in touch with what's actually happening enough to know what is going on? Maybe in that we have a sense of camaraderie and with people who are dealing with certain situations, and we want to allow our hearts to be touched enough, so that we're moral. But after that, a little goes a really, really long way, right? And so I have a question for you, kind of going back here.
All right.
Yeah. How do you do it? How do you decide for yourself what's useful? What's enough? Or maybe even just honestly, we're living in historically extraordinary times. What's just interesting? I mean, I'm really interested in all the weird stuff that's going on. How do you sort that out from too much?
So when we first went into this, I was consuming a lot of news and really wanted to arm myself with a lot of information.
Yeah.
Then as we kind of settled into it and it became a reality that we were going to shut things down and schools were going to close and our entire lives were going to be sort of transformed without any capacity for us to change that. I started to develop those sense of this. I could feel that stickiness to thinking about everything that's wrong, and realized exactly what you said. Through my mindfulness practice, became aware of I'm spending a lot of my energy, mental energy and time and awareness spent on this problem, and I've done everything that I can do. I wash my hands, I'm socially distancing, I'm doing all the things that I can control. And now what is the purpose of all of this extra thinking? And so I started to just intentionally cut back on the amount of time I would spend reading news and social and engaging in social media. So I do after I get up and do some things in the morning, some routines. I indulge about 5 minutes of just checking the news to see if there's anything important that's developed that I need to know about, and then I cut it off the rest of the day, because I figure if there's something that I really, really need to know, someone's going to call me or text me, or, I'm going to find out, I'm going to get a news alert or something that tells me what's going on, but I don't need to continue to expose myself to that all day long. So that's been sort of my approach to it.
That's great. So forgive me for turning the tables on you here. And
That's fine.
so, yeah. Okay. So how do you regulate your craving? I'm going to use that word deliberately. Your craving, as it were, your desire for news, for that kind of stimulation. How did you regulate yourself inside yourself to kind of change your habit a little bit?
It was a desire, I guess, that changed what I craved. I craved peace of mind and stability more than information, that overload. So I wanted to be stable for my wife, for my children, for my parents, for my friends, for the folks that I work with. I wanted to be a presence of stability and a calmness in the storm, even though, because inside I was feeling as though I was becoming unsteady, and so that the desire for that steadiness outweighed my desire for information, I guess.
Yeah, that's very cool. It reminds me of this proverb that wisdom is choosing a greater happiness over a lesser one, right? In other words, there are rewards or gratifications, let's say, in the news obsession, but you knew there was a higher road, right? There was a greater happiness that was available to you, and you chose that, and you helped yourself enjoy it and be motivated toward it, so it became a new habit. And I think that process right there is so fundamental in general. We can help ourselves want what's good for us that we don't naturally want, maybe initially. And I think that's a lot of what we do with children. We try to help them value certain ways of being so that gradually they will be more and more naturally inclined in that direction.
I'm going to do just an awkward segue into my next question, because I don't know how to bridge what we just talked about to this next question. But so I'm just going to ask it. I want to ask it before we're done. So going back to 1974 in your bio, it says that's when you started meditating. And I'm always fascinated, especially leaders in this field. What was it that sort of sparked an interest in contemplative practice, and how did you become acquainted with meditation and those types of practices, and why?
I'd been interested since really early childhood in essentially in what makes us suffer and what makes us happy. I mean, I grew up in a decent, kind of lower middle class suburban environment in Southern California, intact family, nothing horrible, no trauma, no abuse, nothing. But I just noticed that all around me, normally, there was a lot of bickering, stressing, fussing, hassle in people. I just noticed it, just normal range stuff. And I kind of wondered as a little kid, why? That's really there for me in my memories, in a sense. And then for various reasons, including ways in which, on the one hand, my parents, while being loving and decent, both lacked empathy. And also, I was very young going through school, so I experienced a lot of social isolation, being left out, not really being bullied, but just being ignored and disappeared and unwanted. So all that accumulated. So by the time I landed in college at 16, I was really interested in, like, what's going on? I was neurotic. I was miserable. I was like, what, right? And coincidentally and happily, the whole human potential movement was really starting to develop at that time. I started at college in 1969, at East Meets West, new psychology, humanistic psychology, all kinds of great stuff going on. And I just dove in, but I had no sense really of meditation. It was all very sort of Western and, if you will, secular. And then in the last quarter at UCLA, I just thought, wow, it'd be great to learn about Eastern stuff, Eastern philosophy and religion, just understand it. I was kind of raised a casual Methodist, and I thought, I'd like to know about other people. And then kaboom, meditation, of course, it's not religious per se. People can add those qualities to it if they choose. They don't need to. 90+% of the time in my own practice, it's essentially entirely secular. But what started to happen was that I felt the immediate truth of it. I felt that, wow, there's a calming and there's a way of being aware of myself, kind of centered in being rather than doing. The wisdom of the ages that everything keeps changing, and if we try to stop it or freeze it or cling to it, we'll create suffering for ourselves and others. That seemed really clear. And that just kind of set me on my way. It has always seemed to me, gosh, as a person, it's sort of like when I'm out in the wilderness, my nature is to see a hill and to think, well, I wonder what the view is like from there. I'd like to kind of get up there and learn what that's like. And in terms of this one life we have, which is so precious and we're so frail and vulnerable, what kind of experience do we want to have of it, right? And what's possible? Is it possible to be less irkable? Funny word. Is it possible to have more, have an unshakable core, of resilient well-being inside oneself, even amidst all the madness around you? Is that actually possible? So let's study the people who've really made that their life work. Let's study the people who've really acquired an unshakable serenity while still being very engaged in the world, effective, strong, moral, courageous, upright, and so forth. How do they do that, right? The people who, when you're around them, you just feel calmer and happier, and it's okay. Like Mr. Rogers, right? How did he do that? So I just think it's really useful to study people who are exemplars of anything. If you want to get better at making French fries, well, study people who are really good at barbecue or French fries, right? In the same way, we could study people who've really cultivated this deep wisdom, this deep happiness, this deep love, this deep inner peace, and understand through kind of reverse engineering gradually, oh, how'd they do it? So that's what my book's about, Neurodharma. It's about 7 practices of the highest happiness. We grow them by practicing them. These 7 qualities that you find in people far along, that you can find in yourself as well. And that's just an illustration of the broader point that, for me at least, I have always been deeply interested in helping people find what's actually possible in this life in terms of the, not just not being depressed, but once you kind of move from underwater to treading water, what's available to us in the upper quarter, the upper 10th, let's say, of mental health in the broadest sense. And so that's been an exploration for me my whole life. And, that's what my most recent work is really a kind of a culmination of. But that's what set me on my way. Probably a really long answer to a short question.
That's good. It's good. One of the things that I've noticed about your book, so you've got Neurodharma being released May 5th. You have a book called Buddha's Brain. And clearly, Buddhist philosophy has been a big influence on your work. Mm-hmm. And I've found this challenge of admiring this alignment of the essence of what the Buddha taught with modern neuroscience and psychology, but also desiring to respect secularity and not making anyone feel like I'm promoting religion, especially in a public school setting. Yeah. You seem really comfortable traversing both of those worlds. What advice would you give for people like me who kind of struggle with knowing, like, I want to give credit to where a lot of these ideas came from, but I also don't want someone feeling like I am trying to promote a particular faith system?
It's a great question. I think, one, it's important to have absolute respect for the distinctions, and also respect for the culture of the context in which we're teaching. For example, if someone said, as a kind of principle in life, love your neighbor as yourself, that's not an inherently religious statement. It's actually comes out of the Christian tradition, but it's not an inherently religious statement. Don't kill other people, thou shalt not kill. That's not an inherently religious stand. So to me, I have profound respect for religion and spirituality. I'm quite a spiritual person. That said, I think it's really okay to talk about what are simply universal human values and skills, ideas and perspectives. And if it's helpful in a particular setting to refer to those ideas or practices, perspectives and practices, without reference to their origins. If it's skillful to do that, I think that's perfectly okay, really. And I myself enjoy the challenge of, it's a little bit like code switching in a sense, in a diversity kind of sense.
Thought about it that way. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. And like, I have a really dear friend who was a Presbyterian minister. He teaches Christian contemplative practice. He has a deep practice. He has a deep faith, and he functions in very mainstream academic settings. And he's teaching. You can feel that the heart he teaches from has really been informed by his spirituality, but the teachings themselves, the actual words, are not particular to his own Christian background. And for me, that's a really admirable way to do it. And so I'm very comfortable. If people don't like that word mindfulness because for them it reads Buddhist and somehow that seems bad, okay. I'm really happy to just simply talk about self-awareness or calming or the fact that helping the body to relax. The children are going to be more effective learners if their bodies are less agitated, but not numb and stiff and frozen in their seats, but rather a kind of a contented well-being, sort of the sweet spot. So I'm really fine with that. One of my favorite experiences in a funny way early on with Buddha's Brain was that I was doing a media tour about 15 years ago, and I ended up on a country and western station out in Nashville, I think, right in the heart of the Bible Belt. And, the culture wars were raging intensely, and these two broadcasters on a Sunday had to do some sort of public service thing. And so there was a book, and you could tell that the book just landed 3 minutes before they had to go on air with me. And like, Buddha's Brain was this. And what I really, and it was live, we were live, right? And what I enjoyed, and it was such a teaching for me, was to ground in respect for the other person, not being contentious, not trying to persuade anyone to anything, and to normalize what I was talking about. And frankly, it was skillful for me, I think. It wasn't condescending, it was skillful to connect what I was talking about steadying your mind, about stability, to traditional values, like from my father from North Dakota, who grew up on a ranch. He was a cowboy. He grew up in, that world of North Dakota, and that culture kind of runs through me. So I could talk about all this as the essence of self-reliance. Do you want to be skillful with your own thoughts and feelings?
Yeah.
No. Do you want to know yourself more fully so you understand why you're having the reactions that you're having to things, including reactions that make stuff worse for you and for other people? Like, yeah. And do you want to develop moral character, that you can be patient and loving even in stressful situations? Do you want to develop grit? Doggedness, fortitude. These are universal values. So I found myself code switching, dropping in that more North Dakota kind of language, but without any kind of disrespect for the people involved. It was just more skillful to do it like that. So that's my background. Yeah.
So much of this is just like a semantical thing, like you said, it's just how you term things. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes when it would be nice if we could have a nuanced conversation about what the Buddha taught with it and be able to articulate and clarify the difference between sort of some of the metaphysical things that built up around the religion of Buddhism versus the very practical applications, in terms of in terms of modern neuroscience and psychology, the very practical applications of what he taught. And I think you do such a good job of doing that respectfully, of kind of having that conversation and making those connections and respecting those original teachings and bringing them up to date and in this sort of modern context with what we know in terms of science, without it coming across as dogmatic or sort of in some type of subversive way, getting people to adopt a religious viewpoint.
Yeah, thank you. I would say, without being a scholar of this territory, I'm quite knowledgeable about the original teachings of the Buddha himself and his contemporaries as they're captured in what's called a Pali canon. Pali is a language, and then the canon is all these oral teachings that were then finally written down several centuries later. And I'm sure there's some distortion in there, but if we just kind of start there, the content is endlessly psychological. Right? And there are these kind of cultural references to spirits in the forest and reincarnation and so forth, but it's not fundamental to the psychology of it. Right. And the essence of which essentially is, crave less, love more.
Right.
Okay. I was in the Boy Scouts. It wouldn't surprise me if my Scoutmaster said something like that. Don't be so uptight. Keep, think about other people. Like, oh yeah, Good advice.
Right. That's the thing I keep telling myself. Like when I find myself suffering at all through this pandemic thing,
Yeah.
it's craving things being other than the way they are, and
Yeah.
that's where the Buddha taught us.
Yeah.
That's where
Yeah.
suffering's generating, is
Yeah.
wanting things other than the way they are, and
Yeah.
stronger
That's right.
that feeling, that intensity, the more suffering you're creating for yourself, rather than just sort of riding through it. And you're
Yeah.
experiencing some pain and experiencing the normal ups and downs of human existence, but you're not adding on that layer of suffering by constantly being at odds with what is.
Yeah, that's right. And to be clear, this is, as you know, I'm going to kind of make sure it's clear for the record. This is not about apathy or indifference or withdrawal from life at all, actually. Um, and historically, the Buddha made a strong critique of that, because that was sort of the attitude of his time. He said, no, there's a middle way. You can be engaged in life, feeling what you're feeling with wholesome goals. You can
Right.
have ambitions. You can try to, grow a business. You could take care of children. You want to help other people. You respect your parents. You can have healthy goals without being so contracted and tense. And, as you say, and clinging to certain kinds of results. So both are really true. A weird phrase for me that I don't know where it came from in my mind, but is frictionless contentment.
Mm,
Working on it.
like
But
that.
it's just like you said, it's not having all that friction between us and the world, even as we move forward for the sake of others and ourselves toward what is beneficial.
Yeah. In your book, Neurodharma, you use what I think is a really helpful metaphor of red zone and green zone brain settings. And I've talked a lot about, in my work with teachers, is getting them to sort of recognize when they're being reactive versus when they're being responsive. It could be to a difficult parent, an administrator who's being particularly challenging, or a student exhibiting maladaptive behaviors. A lot of teachers can get in the bad habit of getting reactive and overreactive, and therefore not only don't make this situation better, but they're also creating a lot of their own stress. And that sounds a little bit like I'm blaming the victim, but can you help articulate, if you don't mind, what you mean by red zone, green zone, and how this might apply to teachers cultivating a more peaceful state of mind and sort of classroom environment?
Yeah. So it's a great question. Super practical. The world is continually challenging us, much as it challenges other animals. I look out my window. I live just north of San Francisco, and I see golden squirrels in my backyard trying to get into the bird feeder and get the food. And then the blue jays come and they quarrel. It's right. Sounds like junior high, right? Anyway, and the world challenges us. It challenges us in terms of our needs. We have three major needs: to be safe, satisfied, and connected, broadly defined, which we manage by avoiding harms for safety, approaching rewards for satisfaction, and attaching to others for connection. So we have avoiding, approaching, and attaching. These are familiar ideas in psychology and biology. This particular framework I've kind of developed in a really summary, clear way. So the question then becomes, how do we manage our needs when they're challenged? That's the key question. There's no end to challenges. We have fundamental needs. The only question is, do we do it, while being caught up in fighting or fleeing or freezing? Or do we manage our needs by being centered in a fundamental sense of resilient well-being, calm coping, with an open heart?
Mm.
That's the key question. And so the distinction is, when there are times in life to run for your life, or I had an experience when our son was very young, of the apartment building we were in starting to burn from the other end. And I raced into our apartment, which was at the end away from the fire, but still there was some risk there, to get my computer disks for my dissertation. This was a while ago. The car keys, my shoes, and our son's teddy bear.
Yeah.
And he ran out the door. Okay, I was in the red zone. It was all blinking red. I was totally fired up. I had to do it. I mean, there's a place for that. But in the wild, in terms of our evolutionary biological template, those episodes of, let's call it red zone stress, are designed to be brief and infrequent. And most of the time, animals are just kind of hanging around. But in modern life, we humans often live in the red zone, or call it even the pink zone, kind of mild chronic sense of fear and anger or helplessness in terms of safety, or a chronic sense of disappointment, frustration, or drivenness, or even addiction in terms of satisfaction. Or we live in a kind of chronic sense of feeling inadequate, less than others, ashamed, and or resentful, jealous, envious, caught up in us against them rivalries, red state, blue state, us against them, and so forth. And so that's how a lot of us live, which creates enormous wear and tear on physical health, creates wear and tear on our experience of living, and it takes months, if not years, off the lifespan. On the other hand, if we develop various psychological resources inside, like mindfulness, like compassion, like skills, social skills with other people, emotional intelligence, positive emotions in general, positive mood in general, self-regulation, impulse control. I mean, the kinds of stuff we're trying to help our kids develop too. As we grow these inner strengths, these kind of standard, there's nothing airy-fairy about them, standard psychological resources inside, as we grow them, then when challenges come, we don't feel so flooded by them. We feel resourced in the face of those challenges, so that we might be like irritated for a few dozen seconds, maybe a few dozen minutes, but then we come back to center pretty fast and then chill out and deal with whatever the situation is without, getting particularly upset about it. We can do that based on having these resources grow over time. The other thing is that, and I call that the green zone. That's the green zone. That's the responsive mode. Red zone is the reactive mode. And then last, the great opportunity again and again is to grow those resources by experiencing them. This is the fundamental how of social emotional learning. We must experience what we want to grow. And then in the second necessary step, we must turn that experience into a lasting change in the brain. Without that lasting change in the brain, it might have been a beneficial experience in the moment, but it has no lasting value. We didn't learn anything from it in the broadest sense. So by slowing down a little bit, when we're experiencing the strengths we want to grow, we can actually hardwire them into ourselves. Also, when we experience an enoughness of needs met in the moment, so there's in three broad terms, there's a sense of peacefulness inside, calm, strength inside for safety. When there's an opportunity to feel a sense of enoughness of satisfaction, there's a sense of gratitude, gladness, contentment, accomplishment. When there's a chance to feel an enoughness of connection, we feel caring and we can feel cared about. Again, there too, once you're experiencing it, stay with it for a breath or longer to internalize that felt sense inside yourself. So in these two ways, deliberately growing psychological resources, and second, deliberately internalizing the felt sense of needs met, we do gradually build up a responsive core inside ourselves that becomes increasingly unshakable and unconditional because it's hardwired into us. And on the basis of that unshakable core, then we can deal with the challenges of life, including bigger and bigger challenges in life for the sake of others and ourselves, without it having a sense of discontent and disturbance invade the core of our being. And that's the great opportunity. I'll finish with this. There's this kind of a proverb that says the purpose of practice is to expand the range of experiences and circumstances in which we are free. It's easy to be calm and centered when everyone is telling you how great you are. But when people start criticizing you or wanting more than you can do or insisting that you carry 5 quarts every day in a 1-gallon bucket, which I think is a lot of so many educators, unfortunately, even though that's happening in the core of your being, it doesn't have to invade you.
Right. I love the fact that you mentioned the fact that some people view these practices as airy-fairy. Some of them see them strictly as spiritual practices or woo-woo. And I love the fact that you as a psychologist, as a scientist, are validating that, no, these aren't you can use certain practices for spiritual growth and development, but that there's a very real scientific thing happening here that, as we understand neuroscience, that we can actually rewire the brain for greater joy and happiness and well-being. Can you, for the listeners who heard what you said, but maybe need a little bit more explicit explanation, how do they go about cultivating that green zone in a very practical sense? Like, what is the practice that you would recommend or routines that they do to help them with that?
Yeah, thank you. And I want to acknowledge, partly because I feel in such rapport with you, that I'm just, turning on the fire hose. And
It's good. It's good.
Yeah. You're really getting at the fundamental process of how does learning happen? And educators are really on top of how academic learning happens. And there is even a growing movement, as you know, better than I do, to teach children learn to learn. In other words, how do we teach children the kind of skills and attitudes they can engage inside their own mind when they are in the classroom or when they're reading a textbook to improve the rate at which they're actually acquiring that information or those ideas or those skills, right? So educators are way ahead of people in mental health, like myself, way ahead of people who are more engaged in, healing, psychotherapy, coaching, counseling, and also human resources training around things like stress management, mindfulness training, self-compassion training, things like that. Educators are ahead. So how do people fundamentally learn? Which really means, how does the brain change over time? And it does so fundamentally in a two-step process. So step one is there must be some kind of pattern of activation. The child has heard the information about, what is 7 times 4? Okay. Or the child has had an experience of what it's like to want to slug someone who takes their basketball, but instead restrains that impulse. Or goes out of their way to be kind to a kid who has lower social status and is kind of being picked on. All right. You start with the experience. Yeah. There must be an underlying pattern of neural activation that underpins that experience. And then, in the necessary second step, that pattern of activation neurologically must leave a lasting change behind it through the processes of consolidation in neural networks. That's the fundamental process. So we can help that process ourselves from the inside out. Our brains are continually being influenced by various factors coming at us from the outside, coming from the inside in terms of our physical body, and also from our mind, our life experiences that are now bubbling up. We're being jerked around by all these things. And the ways that we're jerked around by all these forces change us. On the other hand, we have a profound power to influence who we are becoming. In other words, we can take charge in a lot of ways of the brain change process from the inside out and help ourselves grow a little, learn a little every day, become a little wiser, a little stronger, a little happier, a little more loving every day. We have that power. And my books are really about learning to learn, as it were, in the social, emotional, somatic, motivational, attitudinal, even spiritual territory. Not so much learn to learn academic, conceptual, cognitive material. As valuable as that is, it's just not my profession. And so, what people can do concretely, and really appreciating that this is literally how the brain changes. There are multiple things a person can do while they're having a beneficial experience to help it really land. Like for myself, I'm talking with my wife and I'm suddenly realizing, ruh-roh, what I said or did 10 seconds ago just was not very skillful. It's not because I'm walking on eggshells. It's I can realize, I didn't need to say it that way. It's understandable that she's reacting. This is not going well. I'm transferring in my stuff with my mother to my wife or whatever. You know what I mean? Like I realized, ruh-roh, and I want to learn. I want to get better right there. How can I help myself? So, for example, if we stay with an experience for more than a few seconds in a row, we're much more likely to internalize it. There's no magic number. There's probably a threshold of at least a few seconds. My metric is half a breath, a full breath, 5, 10 seconds, maybe longer. There's a famous saying, you know it, neurons that fire together, wire together. So the longer the neurons are firing, the more they're going to wire together. New connections will form, existing connections will get strengthened. Neurochemicals like serotonin or dopamine will be increasingly fostered to flow. Capillaries will start extending into parts of the brain that you're repeatedly engaging, so they get more blood, so they get more supply, so they can get stronger. It's a little bit like analogous to building muscles in your body. You are building circuits and improving function in your brain. So if you keep the experience going, you're going to support that process. If you feel it more in your body, the more we take the idea, let's say, of gratitude, and we open to the feeling of it. Or for a lot of people, they know they are liked, like their colleagues at work. They know their colleagues respect them, but they don't feel respected. They don't feel it for various reasons. They're busy, they're running around, maybe they're kind of out of touch with themselves. So try to feel it in your body. As teachers know, school teachers know, the more the kids are active and embodied with their learning, especially if they're relatively young, the more they're going to gain from what's happening in the classroom. And then a third key takeaway neurologically is to highlight what's rewarding about it, what's enjoyable or meaningful about the experience that you're having. Because as the sense of reward increases, so like help yourself, like it feels really good to be grateful. Or with me and my wife, let's say, like a sense of relief that I'm not going to get in trouble next time. It feels good. Or I'm proud of myself that I'm not a jerk, as a husband. I really want to do better. And I notice also that when she can see that I'm recognizing how I kind of misstepped here, she's nicer to me. And that's rewarding too, right? It's just harmony in a long-term marriage. So those are rewarding experiences. So the more we focus on reward, the more activity of dopamine and norepinephrine there is in the brain, these neurochemicals. And as their activity increases, so does the wiring of the experience at the time into long-term storage. So these are different things people can do. They're grounded in neuroscience. You can just do them in the laboratory of your own mind. You can run experiments inside your own mind. And I think for me, the takeaway, maybe when we're done, I'll tell you my 5-minute challenge. Before we end, I'll tell you my 5-minute challenge. But the takeaway for me is, listen to the longings in your heart. Deep down inside us, we all kind of know more of who we'd like to be, right? Nothing wrong with who we are, but who do we want to help ourselves be? Like I'm helping myself be more continuously at ease and contented in the midst of this corona storm, right? I want to grow those things. Well, when you're experiencing something you want to develop in yourself, you want to cultivate, right? You want to acquire, value it, slow down. Receive it into yourself. Don't waste it on your brain for the course of a single breath, right? And then if you start to move through your day looking for what you'd like to grow, and then treating yourself with kindness and respect, that you matter enough to slow down to actually grow it in yourself for 5 or 10 or 20 plus seconds at a time, that changes your whole day. And fairly quickly, you really feel different because you're growing a good inside yourself, literally hardwired into your own nervous system.
I have a question for you. It's a little bit beyond the scope of kind of like what we've been talking about, but
go for it, man.
But it's just kind of something that's been on my mind. Whenever you start to follow, the neuroscience interests me, the meditation parts interest me, and one of the things that's come up as I've studied through all these connected areas is this concept of non-duality and the concept of the default mode network. And one of the things that I've found interesting that I've played around with in my mindfulness practice, as I can sort of sense that default mode network, that narrator telling me the story of who I am, as that quiets, that there's this opening and this a greater sense of interconnectedness, which makes me think that maybe there's something to this concept of non-duality. As a neuropsychologist, what is your sort of view of the role of the default mode network and the concept of non-duality, and how these contemplative practices can help um, build an awareness about that? Is that woo-woo, or is that something that you've experienced or that you have thoughts on as a scientist?
Oh, yeah. So bows to you, Todd, for just, the depth of the question. And I would say for myself that I try to be modest and accurate in the language. So I would describe myself as a clinician. And I would say that it's fair to say that I'm quite scholarly about it. I don't call myself a scientist in the sense that there are people who are generating a lot of science, they're generating research, and I wouldn't put myself so much in that category. So just to be modest here, so how to do this succinctly? It's a fantastic question. So just to reset again for people in general, the so-called default mode has to do with cortical networks in the midline of the cortex. So if you draw a line from the top of your forehead in the middle all the way kind of toward the back of your head where it starts to curve downward, in the back half or so of that area, spreading a little to the sides, is a network, and it got the term default mode because it became active when people were not doing anything in particular. And it's distinct from a so-called task-positive network that's more toward the front of the midline, that's engaged when we're doing various tasks. When people are in the default mode, the good news is that it's, we kind of, we space out, we daydream, we kind of sort things out. The brain does some internal physiological housekeeping, kind of takes out the garbage to some extent. But the problem is that, particularly with our training through modern media to spend a lot of time in imagination, the problem is that when people are caught up in negative rumination about the past or the future, doing so-called mental time travel, that phrase too, mostly it's negative. It's usually negative, or people have a wandering mind. They have a hard time focusing. They have a hard time being steady. So a little bit of the default mode network activation is good, but most people, it's too much. It's not helpful to them. So then the question, and also the default mode processing is saturated with me, myself, and I. It's very self-referential, with the kind of suffering that can come with taking things so personally and getting possessive and positional. All right. What you've noted in your experience is that as you, let's say, meditate in whatever form you do, maybe just simply being aware of your body, being aware of breathing, just kind of calming, right? What happens is that default mode activity starts really decreasing dramatically. Because you're no longer doing mental time travel in the future or the past, you're really in the present. There's less verbal activity, there's less sense of self, and therefore suffering diminishes. And there's more of a sense of wholeness and being whole. Yeah. And calm and peace and contentment and just sort of being rather than stressful doing. That's great. So then the question becomes, when you use the term non-dual, for me, it's helpful to flag three kinds of non-duality. And I think that trouble begins when people mush together these categories or don't mark the distinction when they move from one kind of non-duality to another. So I'll just sort it out here. Not to be pedantic, but to me, it's useful experientially.
I'm on edge, ready to hear this.
Okay. Yeah, and you can erase it later. But anyway, so one form of non-duality, the kind of like level, I'll do it as levels, but I don't mean they're better. I'll just say the first form is experiential non-duality, in which there's a growing sense of being whole. So you're aware of all of your everything you're experiencing as part of a single whole. An example of that is an image. Like right now we're seeing each other, or we can look around a room. There are many things we're seeing, but we experience it as a single gestalt, a single unified experience. We can do that with our body. We can be aware of the sensations of breathing, let's say in a fairly small area in the chest, and then gradually widen out to have an ongoing sense of the body as a whole, with many sensations bubbling like effervescent, soda water, popping. inside that single surface of the glass of water, that single field of sense of awareness of the body. And then you can broaden out to include hearing, seeing, thinking, and so forth. So you start experiencing. Consciousness is experienced as a whole, right? And the element of awareness increasingly is woven into that whole, so that there's a non-duality increasingly between awareness and its objects. There's just one single mind process occurring. I mean mind as the totality of our consciousness, not just intellect. Okay. So far, so good?
Yes.
And what's great is that literally neurologically, and I talk about this in the Neurodharma book, in the, I think, basically the wholeness and nowness chapters. When we move neurologically into the sense of things as a whole, activity in the default mode decreases, becomes very quiet. Activity in the frontal regions of that midline network that are more task-oriented, they get quiet too. Doing falls out. And at the same time, activity in networks on the sides of the brain, especially right-sided for right-handed people for whom the right hemisphere is involved with Gestalt holistic processing, the sense of things as a whole. Networks on the sides of the brain, especially on the right side, just switched for many left-handed people, but same point, gets much more active. That's what's going on neurologically. And in that neurological shift to this sense of things as a whole, what also tends to happen is that attention networks, neural networks that support attention, shift from focused attention that's doing one thing after another to a more primal, fundamental attention network that's continuously updating consciousness with whatever we are alerted to. Think about an animal in the wild, a squirrel in my backyard. Something has happened. The first quarter second, first half second, there's a sense of updating consciousness or the mind process, updating what we're experiencing to take into account the new thing. We don't yet know what it is necessarily or what to do about it, but something has changed. Something has happened. There's a freshness right there. Well, when we start moving into the sense of things as a whole in this experientially non-dual way, that more primal attention system that really brings us into the front edge of now, really brings us close to the emergent present, becomes more active in this continual updating of consciousness. Before we've had time to start fussing and feuding and selfing inside our mind. So those things are happening neurologically, just at experiential non-duality. Then there's a sense of non-duality in which we are connected with the entire natural world.
Right.
So this is a non-duality in which we start feeling more one with everything. You know, the boundaries start blurring. Sometimes people have extraordinary non-dual experiences that are like once-in-a-lifetime experiences. And that's a very intense version of this in which the self-world distinction disappears and the world shines forth in radiant perfection. About a third of the people worldwide surveyed will describe having had experiences like that, some within a religious frame, many outside of a religious frame, often in nature, often when there's some kind of surprise involved, but it just boom. I'm interested in how what we can learn about that in ordinary life, like driving in traffic, right? While feeling more one with everything. So that's the second kind of non-duality. And I explore that in the allness chapter, the sixth practice, opening into allness, and the underlying neurology of that. So when that's happening, networks in the brain that are natural to us shift out of an egocentric frame of perceptual processing that's dualistic, in which there's my perspective on the world. And that egocentric perspective, it's not a value judgment, it's just called egocentric, really gets engaged when things are close to us, friend or foe, right? Close in the Stone Age or Jurassic Park, right? On the other hand, there's a natural perceptual framework that occurs in the brain. We tend to move back and forth between these two several times a minute that scientists call allocentric, in which we are aware of things as a whole impersonally without privileging our perspective in it. Like what's the jungle as a whole, allocentric, and then who? That sound in the bush next to me, what's that? What should I do about it? That's egocentric. We move back and forth. Well, when we are in the second kind of non-duality, in which we have more of a sense of oneness with everything, we have a sense of being a local expression of reality altogether. We are a distinct wave in the ocean, but we are a local expression of the entire sea, right? And our nature all along is water. So when you start tuning into that more and more, that's the second kind of non-duality. It's wonderful, it's profound, and it is still inside of ordinary reality. Then there's a third kind of non-duality in which there's a sense of something or a belief in something that is meaningfully distinct from the ordinary Big Bang universe that bubbled into being nearly 14 billion years ago, and you and I are in it, our waves inside the great ocean of allness of the Big Bang universe. Well, many people, myself included, have a sense of and even a belief in something that's meaningfully transcendental. I'll use that word, transcendental, transcends ordinary reality. And that third kind of non-duality starts approaching the natural and the transcendental as in a non-dual way. So there's more of a sense of the transcendental, and then people use words like immanence, immanence of the divine, a sense of presence of something that's a consciousness, a love, a timelessness, a vastness, an absoluteness that somehow it permeates or is part of or is the ground of something, the natural universe, which as a natural universe still includes a lot of wacky stuff like black holes and quantum entanglement and all kinds of stuff like that. So that's that third kind of non-duality. And what in the world is happening in the brain in that third kind? To the extent, if one grants that, okay, let's suppose the transcendental is actually real, and there's more to things than a dogmatic atheist would acknowledge. If we imagine that possibility, I don't preach it, I don't push it, but if we imagine it, how might the transcendental interact with the natural? That's a profound question. Theologians have been banging on that for a long time. I'm not a professional, in this area, but I think it's a very, very deep question. I think that as I write about in the last chapter, the timelessness chapter, the finding timelessness, it's the seventh practice. It's the ninth chapter in the book. It's the seventh practice, finding timelessness. I do explore the ways in which natural phenomena, particularly in deep contemplative practice, can increasingly be like, not the same as, but like the actual transcendental, particularly in reference to what the Buddha highlighted as unconditioned, not conditioned, not caught up in time, not subject to arising and passing away, and therefore ultimately more reliable for the most sublime and durable forms of happiness in the broadest sense. And so as the mind gets very quiet, the field of awareness is effectively unconditioned because it can represent anything. It's conditioned in the sense of occurring due to underlying causes in the body and so forth, but it's effectively unconditioned. It's a field of possibility. And if we suspect that attributes of the transcendental include timelessness, that which is still, that which is spacious, that which is eternal, that which is a field of possibility, always just before conditioned actuality within the natural universe. Well, within the natural universe, as we calm our minds and quiet them quite radically so that very little conditioned thoughts or feelings are appearing, it gets really, really quiet. And we're really just kind of resting primarily in awareness. It's like the unconditioned. And my own suspicion and hunch that I elaborate in the book is that when people do deep, deep practice, or they have these radical, non-ordinary, they're called self-transcendent experiences, that something is happening in the brain that is like transcendental reality, the ultimate. And because it's so like it, there's an ease of permeating there. There's an ease of access. People become accessible because their brains are so like the divine in that moment, or some quality of the divine. I'm not saying that people are divine in some grandiose sense, you know what I mean? But
No.
they're like it, that suddenly there's an opening there. And that which is actually transcendental can become much more apprehensible to a person, much more experience to a person. We become much more accessible to it, including in ways that are life-changing and transformative.
Yeah. So I've been thinking about this in a very practical sense for people who are experiencing anxiety right now over getting COVID-19. And what I've
Yeah,
been trying to think of is how to articulate to them, if you can go deep into practice and you get a glimpse of this transcendence,
yeah,
and then you come back and you're still with COVID-19, but you've had this glimpse into, it may even be just a few seconds of just having that transcendent experience. You're no longer gripped so tightly by when you come back and the default mode network gets activated and you're thinking, and you have that inner narrator. The voice of the narrator that is just kind of, you can kind of laugh at a little bit more, and not take it so seriously, and be so identified with Todd Scholl, and you kind of see that there's kind of a bigger picture, a bigger connection. There's a bigger field of awareness that you can connect to, and it makes the sort of threats, they're still there, but they just don't have the same weight to them, I guess, maybe because you realize the ego is just sort of this artificial construct, and it doesn't have to be taken so seriously. Am I way off there, or am I?
no, you're a teacher, Todd. I mean, you're a school teacher, but clearly you have a deep practice and you are really articulate about it. And so we're having a conversation here, in some ways as peers. And so I think you said it just right. We've really gotten into the deep end of the pool. I mean, we've gone for it here, right?
Mm,
But um, my own my own interest in this territory is, one, I have a desire, like so many do, to know what's really true as fully
right.
and as ultimately as possible. So I'm really interested in, uh, science and the
Mm,
latest. I'm also really interested in the ultimate. What is the ultimate nature of our experiences and ordinary reality? And is there actually something beyond ordinary reality? Da, 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 da.
yeah,
So that interests me. But beyond all that, I'm super interested in the practical applications. Like I said, why not study people? Much as if we want to get good at cooking, watch a cooking show. How do they do it, right?
yeah,
You get good at tennis, watch Serena Williams. So if we want to develop this kind of core of resilient well-being, so we feel happier more of the time, and we return to our home base of natural well-being faster when we're rattled or knocked out of it. Like, let's study people who are good at it and develop these qualities in ourselves. So absolutely, I've for me, it's super practical, and it's totally true that as people, without it, without any fireworks, fireworks are great, right? But a lot of people have these fireworks experiences without psychedelics, let's say, just for whatever reason. They're one off experiences. They don't change them, they don't grow from them. If anything, sometimes they're disturbing because they crave them. They want to go back to that experience. They're not integrated. So without fire, and I'm not against fireworks because often those can be really transformative for people, but without fireworks, when a person has a little more sense of wholeness, a little more sense of of being in the present, and a little more sense of being entwined with other people, with nature, with the physical universe altogether, that is really great for dealing with, the idiots at work, or the pain
right,
in your
right,
back,
right,
or the frustration, who took
right,
my cheese, right?
exactly.
Uh,
So when
they're
you come back
so
down,
helpful.
you still have to do the dishes, and you still have to deal with traffic and
Yeah,
stuff. So it's kind of, yeah,
yeah,
that's my interest as well, is how do we take what we're learning in these things that sometimes we get so, you know, so we
yeah.
think of it so esoteric and deep, and they are, but then when you come back down and and there's real things to do. How do we bridge those two worlds more effectively?
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally true. Totally true. And I think if it's okay, I'm realizing the time. I've gotten so fascinated talking with you that it's gone longer, and I've got some moles to whack. I mean, life these days, I feel like the mole who's being whacked a lot, but whack-a-mole. Do you want to hear my 5-minute challenge?
Yes, I was on my paper right here. I was going to give you an opportunity to do that before we leave.
Yeah, I'll be succinct. Takes 5 minutes a day or less. 3 parts to it. Part 1, as you go through your day, a handful of times, slow down and take in the good. Slow it down, feel it in your body, enjoy it, receive it into yourself. That will take about 1.5 minutes a day, really. Second, know one thing in particular that you're trying to grow these days inside yourself. Some quality you're developing. Maybe you're trying to help yourself let go of stuff faster. Maybe you're trying to disengage from old pain from your childhood. Maybe you're trying to, let's say, for myself, become more skillful with your wife, let's say. What are you trying to develop these days? What's one thing? You can have a couple, but one thing at least that you know in particular you're trying to train, essentially. Then look for experiences of it that you internalize in that 2-step process. Second step, don't forget it. That's part 2. That'll take another minute or so a day, really. And it organizes your day and it gives you hope because you know that you're growing, you're developing a little bit every day in something that matters. And it gives you a sense of you're taking charge of something in your life at a time when, understandably, we feel so buffeted and helpless. Third, marinate in deep green. Come home to deep green for 2-3 minutes at least a day. Maybe just before bed. Maybe when you wake up in the morning, you just kind of reset to that fundamental, authentic sense, in whatever ways you experience it, of peacefulness, contentment, and love. There are related words like gratitude or gladness or thinking of things that make you happy for contentment. Peacefulness could be a sense of calm strength, your own gritty fortitude, and kind of with a fundamental underlying serenity, on top of which is a lot of worry and a lot of frustration, perhaps, but in your core, there's serenity. And then love, of course, however you experience it. So take a minute or more at least to help the sweet animal of the body to settle into deep green and repair and refuel itself. So that's the 5-minute challenge. Take in the good several times a day. Second, look for a particular strength you're trying to grow. 3, come home and rest in deep green for at least a few minutes a day.
Yeah, we received a text here in South Carolina last night from the governor. It says, "Go home and stay home." And so I used that as sort of the sort of subject of our mindfulness practice last night. We're all going to go home and stay home for a little bit.
Yeah, that's great.
But I want to thank you so much for your time. We've gone way over, and it's just been an honor and a pleasure to speak with you. And I look forward to folks reading your new book, Neurodharma, coming out May 5th. And I'm going to share, as we close out, I'm going to share some other resources with our listeners, but want to thank you again for your time.
Oh, thank you, Todd. And this was a deep dive. And thank you for putting up with my long riffs here. I appreciated that.
Thank you. That's Dr. Rick Hanson. And you can find him on social media, on Facebook at Rick Hanson, PhD, and that's Hanson with an O-O-N at the end. You can find him on Twitter at Dr. R. Hanson, that's D-R-R Hanson. On Instagram at Rick Hanson, PhD, and on YouTube at Dr. R. Hanson. And you can check out his website, rickhanson.net. I want to thank him so much for being on the podcast and giving up his time, and his book, Neurodharma, May 5th. Get it however you have to get it. Please don't violate social distancing rules, but highly recommend that book. I was able to get an advanced copy, and just know that you're going to really benefit. If you enjoyed this conversation, that you're going to love the book. So thanks again for Dr. Hanson for being on the podcast. Thank you for listening. If you're interested in being a part of our network, you can go to teachersaligned.org and connect with us there. We're on Facebook at Teachers Aligned. and on Instagram at Teachers Aligned Network. Thank you so much. And don't forget to check out the Self-Care for South Carolina Educators group on Facebook. Lots of great stuff going on there. You all have a great week.